Hello, and welcome to This Week Explained, your essential download on the global stories making headlines. We're ready to unpack yet another complex week from around the globe, but before we dive in, just a quick reminder. If you want to get alerted to new episodes as they are released, make sure you're following or subscribed wherever you're listening right now. It's the easiest way to stay updated. And hey, if you're enjoying the show and want to help others discover it, leaving a quick rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really makes a difference. Also, did you know that Spotify allows comments? This is a great way to get involved with the podcast. Others can view those comments, and now Spotify is allowing others to interact with your comments. This keeps the conversation going long after the episode airs. Okay. Big news for us, because this week we are excited to announce that this show is now sponsored by BetterHelp. Let's pause for a moment and talk about something very important. Life has its pressures for everyone, and we often carry the immense weight of expectation to never show weakness, to hide our true feelings, and believe that asking for support somehow makes us less of a person. But bottling things up isn't the answer. It can often lead to feeling down, burnout, or other unhealthy habits. We want to normalize the idea that it's okay to struggle. Real strength actually comes from opening up about what you're carrying and doing something about it so you can be your best self for everyone in your life. If you're feeling the weight of the world, or even if things just feel a bit off, I can't stress enough the value of talking to someone. It could be a friend, a loved one, or a therapist. We here at This Week Explained believe that therapy can be incredibly valuable. Whether you've been in therapy personally or not, the broader benefits are clear. It's so helpful for learning positive coping skills, understanding how to set healthy boundaries, and it really empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's important to remember that therapy isn't just for those who've experienced combat or major trauma. It's a tool for anyone looking to improve their mental well-being and navigate life's challenges. That's why we're thrilled that This Week Explained is now sponsored by BetterHelp. With over 35,000 therapists worldwide, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. And it clearly resonates with users, boasting an App Store rating of 4.9 out of 5 stars based on over 1.7 million client reviews. It's also incredibly convenient. You can connect with a therapist at the click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy life. And you can even switch therapists at any time if you feel it's not the right fit. And here's something special for our listeners. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/thisweek. That's betterhelp.com/thisweek. Finally, remember that This Week Explained is part of the awesome Leon Media Network. You can discover more great podcasts over at leonmedianetwork.com. All right, let's get to why you guys are really here. Let's talk about all those stories that are shaping our world. This week, we're breaking down the latest on the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, the latest on U.S. talks with Iran about their nuclear program, and an under-the-radar intelligence story that I think will have Kervin hopping up on his soapbox once again, so you don't want to miss that. Let's start the discussion in Ukraine, where it feels like the situation has taken another particularly dark turn this past week. We saw significant Russian drone attacks on Kiev early Sunday, injuring people, setting apartment buildings on fire, and, just causing general destruction and mayhem. So what's your read on this continued targeting of the capital?
Yeah, look, it's brutal. There's no going around that. This sustained pressure campaign that's coming from Russia is just devastating. Look, we saw more than a dozen Russian drones utilized in this attack, and that wasn't the start of it. That was only after they had an even bigger assault a day earlier, where they saw 14 ballistic missiles and 250 attack drones used. Now, 15 people were injured in that attack. It's one of the biggest assaults on Kyiv that we've seen in over 3 years of this war.
And it's not just Kyiv, right? We heard about 13 civilians killed across the south, east, and north of Ukraine. Odessa's port infrastructure was hit yet again, with Russia claiming they targeted military equipment, but oops, it just accidentally hit the port.
Yeah, it hit infrastructure, critical infrastructure, which they said
they weren't going to do anymore.
They had agreed not to do.
Right. But it was an accident. So, anyways, Kharkiv also saw drone attacks. This feels relentless. And I think you were right, because I think you mentioned last week that it was all a distraction, all of their goodwill kind of, willing to engage in talks and stuff. You implied that it was a distraction.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were absolutely right. The word here is relentless. And it is something that Russia was trying to do a couple of weeks ago in order to set up for these attacks. So, hey, we're going to, go over here, do these peace talks, not with Putin, but we'll put our third string in Turkey, let them go talk so you can distract the world about what's really going on. And now this week, we're seeing all of these attacks. And the Russians are also claiming that they're making advances on the Eastern Front. They said that they captured settlements in Donetsk. They even had one settlement in Sumy. Now, Ukraine, of course, they're not going to acknowledge these losses. That's just, how war works. So I say Russia's saying that they did this. Ukraine's saying we're not going to comment on that. So it's kind of hard to get independent confirmation without purchasing millions of dollars in satellite images and trying to go through that. So I'm not going to be doing that. I'll wait for them to come out in the open market for free. So we've got all this happening, and it kind of paints a picture of this grinding, brutal, offensive push. But it's not, it's not just Russia. There's another side fighting this, and they are fighting. Russia's reported that Ukraine sent over 100 drones over Russian territory. Russia says that they downed all of those. But there were some injuries in a fire in a chemical plant in Tula, Russia. But that plant also makes explosives for the Russian military.
The international reaction has been very strong, at least in words, of course. The UK Foreign Secretary called it, quote, another night of terror, end quote, and the EU's ambassador described it as horrific. President Zelensky himself said these attacks show Moscow is just, quote, prolonging the war, end quote, and is calling for more sanctions because those have worked so well thus far. But there's also this undercurrent of frustration, isn't there? I mean, European leaders seem to be despondent over Trump's refusal to impose more sanctions, over Russia's consistent rejection of a ceasefire.
Yeah, look, words are one thing. I think effective action is a totally different thing, and that's what we're not seeing. On this podcast, we actually think very little of sanctions, especially within Russia. We just don't think it works. It's this slow bleed strategy that they're trying to inflict. And if there's no unified crushing pressure to Russia, then the immediate impact is quite limited. And that's what we're seeing right now. Now, from Moscow's perspective, if they can withstand the current level of sanctions while making military gains on the ground, or at least inflicting significant pain on Ukraine, why are they going to stop this war? Zelensky's right. This does look like the prolonging of a war, grinding Ukraine down, wanting them to surrender.
Amidst all this violence, though, there was this significant prisoner exchange, hundreds from each side, soldiers, and notably a large number of civilians. This was agreed to in Istanbul, the first direct talks in a very long time. So what do you make of this? I mean, good news, finally?
Yeah, it's definitely a rare positive development, at least for the individuals involved and their families. Look, we're talking 390 people from each side. There were 270 servicemen and then 120 civilians that were released. And that's the biggest since this full-scale invasion started. And there is talk of more. They're looking at 1,000 released in total. That's added on to the number that was already released. And that's substantial. You can only imagine the relief of all of those families. And some of these soldiers had been held for 3 years now.
It's heartbreaking to think of what these people have been through. The Russian Defense Ministry showed images of their guys, too, taken to Belarus for checks. So there's this humanitarian aspect, but then Almost in the same breath, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov says that Russia will be ready to hand Ukraine a draft peace accord once this exchange is completed.
Yeah. The time. This is classic Russian maneuvering, right? We see this sliver of goodwill with the prisoner exchange, which, by the way, that was agreed in Turkey when the low-level delegations met for just 2 hours. They made zero progress on a ceasefire. Then we have this explosion of offensives toward Kyiv. And now there's this, what Lavrov calls a prospect of a peace document.
Is it because they're hoping they grind Ukraine down enough that they're willing to capitulate to all of their demands, like allowing them to keep all the territories that they're trying to annex? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's going to be part of it. I think it's, again, yet another distraction.
Okay.
And I've said this for a couple of months now, and it's something another analyst had been talking about, that Putin doesn't want to stop this war. He's in a wartime economy. So the more that is spent on the military in fighting this conflict, the greater the Russian economy can be. So that's why the sanctions aren't working, and there's no need for him unless he has a full outright victory in Ukraine. He doesn't need to agree to a ceasefire.
Okay, so what about the contents, or at least the conditions that are being hinted at in this agreement? Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has stated that Russia is committed to the principles of the Istanbul agreements, and he suggests that a new draft proposal would lay the groundwork for what he calls a, quote, reliable long-term agreement, end quote. However, there's a bit of a mixed message here. Like, in the same breath, Lavrov accuses Ukraine of launching a significant number of drone attacks, claiming as many as 800 in just 3 days. And then he says that these drone attacks were encouraged by European Union countries. Lavrov says the aim of this was to undermine peace efforts, particularly any initiatives supposedly being led by President Donald Trump. But we know Ukraine has already agreed to face-to-face talks with President Putin, and Russia continues to stall that meeting. So what is going on here, in your view?
Well, this is just strategic posturing once again. It's a familiar playbook from the Russian Federation under President Putin. This was happening even before this latest invasion. Moscow is attempting to project itself as the party earnestly seeking a peaceful resolution, even as its military offensive continues unabated. Now, critically, these narratives are beginning to creep into the mainstream. That's a problem. We saw this just a few weeks ago with comments from President Donald Trump. It seemed to echo the Russian assertion that it's actually Ukraine that bears responsibility for initiating the conflict. So Lavrov's specific mention of Trump is strategically significant. I think it's calculated to resonate with segments of the American electorate that continue to question the scale and nature of this unwavering U.S. support for Ukraine. Then we have Lavrov's other recent statements. He's talked about the illegitimate presidency narrative. He reiterated Moscow's position that President Zelensky lacks legitimacy and that, new Ukrainian elections would be a precondition for any substantive peace agreement.
Okay, so we have all this talk about wanting peace and putting forth a ceasefire deal from the Russian side, but how can you negotiate a peace deal with a leader whose legitimacy you publicly deny? It sounds very problematic.
Yeah, problematic. That's an understatement there. Look, it's a non-starter for Kyiv. It essentially demands capitulation before negotiation. We have Ukraine's foreign minister who said Kyiv is waiting for Russia's proposals in the form of talks and a ceasefire, and even suggested a leaders' meeting that could include President Trump. But Zelensky also accused Putin of, quote, trying to buy time, end quote. And that's probably the more realistic assessment. It's one we discussed on this very podcast. We probably for over a year now, we've talked about this trying to buy time tactic from Putin. But Putin sees a war of attrition as a benefit to the Russian military.
Now, Trump himself congratulated them on the prisoner swap, posting, quote, "This could lead to something big," end quote. He also said earlier in the week, after a call with Putin, that they'd immediately start negotiating a ceasefire. So what is going on with that?
Yeah, I'd say any move that reduces suffering, like the prisoner exchange here, that's welcome. But much, listen, it's just like the Oval Office debacle. These interventions from the U.S. often create more noise than signal peace. It's not like Russia is rushing to sign a deal. We've got Italy's Prime Minister Meloni. She's seen as a Trump supporter in the international community, and she offered up a negotiation that would be brokered by the Vatican. That was immediately dismissed by Lavrov as what he said, quote, not a very realistic option, end quote. Look, Russia is going to say a lot of things, but it seems they want to dictate the terms based on the realities they were trying to create on the battlefield, not what's actually going on. They want an agreement that ensures Russia's security. Ukraine wants an agreement that ensures their own security. And I think the details of that security by both countries are vastly different.
So, a glimmer of hope with the prisoners returning home, overshadowed by intense fighting and very tough talk on the diplomatic front. It feels like one step forward, two steps back. For now, I want to shift the focus into some deeply troubling reports out of the war in Gaza. So let's start with Hamas. There's a report out of a London-based Arabic daily news organization painting an extremely grim picture. They're saying Hamas is facing perhaps its most difficult crisis since it was founded.
Yeah, this is actually very significant, Tiana. From what I'm seeing in that report, plus other intelligence that I've seen in the open source, Hamas is facing a multifaceted crisis. We're talking about a severe cash crunch. They're finding it hard to pay their own operatives, let alone government employees in Gaza. Maybe this is some lack of cash flow because there's no more aid to steal because Israel's not letting that aid in anymore. Or, more likely, maybe Iran is cracking down on its unfettered cash flow to the group. But there are reports that Hamas fighters have not been paid in 3 months. That bites hard into morale and operational capability. Could you imagine, Tiana, while I was deployed, not having payments for 3 months? That would be devastating to our morale. Then there's also this relentless Israeli military offensive.
And it's not just financial and military, is it? Like the report mentions a drop in popular support too, which it's about time, honestly. Operatives not being paid in 3 months, Gaza government employees getting just around $250 a month. And services tied to the Hamas government are reportedly decimated, largely unable to function. So does this also impact the civilian population directly?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, when the entity, even a terror organization that's trying to govern a particular place, when they cannot provide basic services or salaries, public frustration is going to mount. This is how revolutions start. Military pressure erodes resources, which erodes governance, which erodes popular support, or at least makes it much harder to maintain popular support. Now, from an analytical standpoint, this weakens Hamas significantly.
Yet Hamas sources cited claims that even though conditions are disastrous, they believe that the group will be able to slowly recover once the war ends, whenever that's going to be. Knowing what you know about their resilience and, well, their history, Kervin, is that realistic or just bravado?
Don't make me say it, Tiana.
Two things can be true at the same time.
Yes, my favorite line. But I think it's true. Two things can be true at the same time. And look, Hamas has proven to be incredibly resilient in the past. They've weathered intense storms. Their ideology is deeply entrenched for a core part of their base. So underestimating their ability to regroup to some extent, that's going to be a mistake. But, quote, slowly recover, that's the operative phrase here. The scale of devastation in Gaza, the depth of the financial crisis we're seeing there, and the potential for a changed post-war political landscape, that means any recovery would be incredibly challenging and likely look very different from their previous periods of control. I really like the line, once the war ends. That's very interesting. to me, because just like you said, when's it going to end? But also, how is it going to end? And when it does end, what does the day after look like? That's going to be crucial.
Yeah, we all know what it would look like if Israel had their way.
Yes.
It's definitely a bleak outlook. And speaking of bleak, Kervin, there's another deeply disturbing report, this one from the Associated Press, and it alleges the widespread use of Palestinians as human shields by not just Hamas, but Israeli soldiers in Gaza. We're talking about accounts from Palestinians and even more Israeli soldiers themselves. What the F?
Yeah, so I would dismiss this as some sort of Hamas propaganda, if not for the fact that it appears, just like you said, some Israeli soldiers at least partially admitted to doing this. But make no mistake, this is an incredibly serious allegation. The forcing of civilians into buildings or tunnels to check for bombs or gunmen, if this is happening as described, this is a blatant violation of international law. As a veteran, somebody who has been in a combat zone, this very concept is abhorrent. But the fog of war is thick, and sometimes false accusations fly, but when you have soldiers reportedly corroborating such practices over a 19-month period, I think we have to talk about it.
I want to pull from the writings of the AP so we don't muddy the waters further. They spoke with 7 Palestinians and 2 members of Israel's military who said they engaged in the practice. And in response, the Israeli military says it strictly prohibits using civilians as shields and that, quote, all such orders are routinely emphasized to the forces, end quote. They also say they're investigating several cases. So what do you make of that disconnect? Do you think it's just the Israeli military trying to save face?
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of it. Look, I mean, it's classic battlefield dilemma. You've got official policy, and then you've got on the ground reality, and it's magnified by the intensity of a conflict like this. Now, militaries, especially democratic ones, we would call Israel a democratic military. It's aligned with the United States. You're always going to have these policies against actions like this. Look, for me personally, before, during, and after every deployment, we would have mandatory rules of engagement training, what we call ROE. We needed to know the Geneva Conventions front to back to front, up and down, the entire thing. This was mandatory. I say all of that, but it doesn't preclude a commander or a platoon sergeant or someone from the E4 Mafia from doing something that goes against those mandates. For me, the question is, how are these policies being enforced? So what happens when soldiers are in extreme threat situations? Does a culture, official or unofficial, emerge that tolerates or actually encourages these tactics to minimize their own force casualties?
The report also mentions that rights groups say Israel has used Palestinians as shields for decades, and that even though the Israeli Supreme Court outlawed the practice in 2005, only in 2005 they outlawed the practice. That is wild. They say that violations are continuing to be documented despite the outlaw of this practice. Experts are saying this war is the first time in decades the practice and the debate around it has been so widespread.
Yeah, I want to touch on the 2005 for just a second. That coincides directly with the movement of Palestinians directly into Gaza, right? So Palestine took over the Strip, governed by Hamas. And so that kind of coincides with that, with the Israeli Supreme Court saying you cannot use those Palestinians as human shields. Should it have just been a law forever? Yes, quite honestly, because Palestinians had been living there the whole time. Now, I think the historical context is vital, especially because Israel has this narrative that Hamas uses human shields. They're the evil ones, but they've been doing it before 2005 and apparently continue to do it over the next decades after 2005. Now, the 2005 Supreme Court ruling was a landmark decision. The rights groups have documented continued violations, and now we're hearing from IDF soldiers and on the ground experts that it's widespread in this conflict. This suggests a systemic issue that official prohibitions have not been eradicated. But the why now, why so widespread question, that's troubling. It could point to the nature of this specific urban warfare environment or the duration of the conflict. Something that comes to mind for me is maybe we're seeing the IDF just, desensitized to the suffering of the Palestinian people. They just don't care. I know some people, especially all through social media, that's their belief, that the Israelis are so desensitized to this that they don't care that they're doing it or that it's happening. Or could we even see that there are actual orders from leadership filtering down despite these official denials that it's happening? Now, the military does say it's investigating, but they're not providing details to the AP about the reach or any orders from commanders. Now, I know that looks like a lack of transparency, but it is very much like a court case. You don't want to put the information out there until you have all of the facts in place. But we've talked about the trust issue in this region. And so with trust already thrown out the window, that lack of transparency does not help build confidence.
And it's all happening amidst a catastrophic humanitarian situation. I mean, the UN is practically screaming for more aid. UN Secretary General Guterres said Palestinians are enduring the cruelest phase of the war. And he mentioned more than a dozen food trucks were looted after a partial easing of the Israeli blockade. And the Israeli army reported 83 aid trucks entered via Kerem Shalom on Friday, but OCHA, the UN's humanitarian office, says that these small amounts are nowhere near enough because it's millions of people. 83
trucks? About 2 millions of people. 2 millions of people.
2 millions of people.
So you got 2 million Palestinians, 83 aid trucks. It's a disaster, plain and simple. Look, the looting is tragic. I saw a video today of Hamas looting all of these. I saw videos of Palestinians suffering and running to the trucks and trying. I don't call that looting. I'm sorry. I call that people suffering, trying to get stuff to save their family and themselves.
Yeah, that's not looting. They are in a dire situation and they are desperate and they aren't getting the help that they're supposed to be getting.
Yep, and when people are starving, societal order breaks down. And then the backdrop to all of this, Israel's offensive grinds on. The civilian suffering is deepening every day. And these allegations of human shield use, that adds another layer of horror. This is not what I was expecting for this week, but when I saw this come up, we had to talk about it.
Absolutely. I appreciate you bringing it up. And it is a lot to process and not the kind of conversation that ends with easy answers. So thank you so much for breaking it down as always. We'll continue tracking this war, but for now, let's shift our focus to an update on Iran's nuclear program. But before we dive in, we need to take a quick break for a message from our sponsors. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. As we hinted at before the break, this week, the world witnessed another round of talks, the fifth, I believe, between Iran and the United States, this time in Rome with Oman mediating. So let us know, Kerbin, what is the headline coming out of this round of talks? Are we any closer to anything at all?
Yeah, the headline is some, but not conclusive progress, which, as you know from covering these things for the podcast, that's diplomatic speak for, quote, we talked, nobody stormed out of the room, but all the big issues, they're still big issues, right?
Some, but not conclusive. It does sound familiar. So what's the not conclusive part? Still the same sticking points we've discussed countless times on previous episodes?
Yeah, you nailed it. You got it exactly right. So it all boils down to uranium enrichment. The American demand is pretty stark now. Iran needs to stop enriching uranium. Period. And Tehran is just as insistent that its program, including enrichment, is a sovereign right and it has to continue. That's the chasm that they're trying to bridge.
And these talks are happening directly, or is it still that proximity talk stance? Like, what am I trying to ask? What I'm trying to ask here is who is in the room for the United States?
No, it's a mixed bag. That's to be sure. It's on the U.S. side had Mideast envoy Steve Witkoff. They also had Michael Anton. That's the State Department's policy planning director, and they're engaging. But that core disagreement on enrichment is the toughest nut to crack here. Interestingly, the U.S. position on enrichment seems to have hardened over the last few months. There was this time Witkoff apparently suggested that Iran could enrich to 3.67%. Now, the new line is all Iranian enrichment has got to stop immediately.
So at least both sides are talking. Iran's foreign minister said their Almani hosts presented some ideas that they will take back, quote, without creating any commitments, end quote. He also said it's too complex for just a few meetings, but that he's hopeful. The U.S. side, though, through an anonymous senior official, said that the talks were constructive and that they made further progress. So, I mean, it sounds cautiously optimistic, but with very low expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Constructive, that's the go-to word when you don't want to say things are falling apart, but you can't announce a breakthrough. So diplomacy, as we know, doing this podcast, there's this delicate dance that they're doing.
And while this dance is happening, Iran's nuclear program isn't exactly hitting pause, is it? I mean, I saw a U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency report say about as much as that. And you've lived and breathed this stuff for decades, deployed in multiple hotspots. So how concerned should we be about their actual capabilities right now?
I'd say extremely worried. I've been extremely worried about Iran's progress since the Obama deal that happened over a decade ago. Now, this DIA report that you talked about, it's sobering. It states Iran has activities that, I want to quote them here, quote, better position it to produce, end quote, nuclear weapons if they choose to. Crucially, it says the time required to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a first nuclear device is probably less than 1 week.
Less than a week? Wow. But producing the material is different from having a deliverable weapon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to clarify that. Experts are saying that it would still likely take Iran months to actually make a working bomb, but we're talking about months, not years, not, a few decades. Look, having that fissile material on hand, or at least the ability to get it that quickly, that changes the entire strategic calculation. Iran, for its part, they insist, look, we're not producing this uranium for weapons. This is for the people of our country.
So, with that kind of capability in their back pocket and their firm stance on continuing enrichment, what's pushing them to the negotiating table at all? I mean, they seem to be holding some strong cards program wise. Is it the sanctions or an internal situation?
Yeah, there's a few reasons here. The goal for Iran in these talks is ultimately the lifting of those economic sanctions, and they need that relief. Now, internally, things are tense. The mandatory hijab issue, that continues to inflame politics. Women are still defying that law, and they're still being beaten for it. There are rumors about potential increases in subsidized gasoline costs, which, as we've seen before, that can spark nationwide protests. Now, Iran may see internally the igniting of a widespread revolution that could topple the regime. And you and I both know the U.S. loves to fan the flames of regime change.
And their currency, the rial, has been in free fall recently, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It hit over a million rial to $1. That was back in April. Now, there's been some improvement with these talks and a little bit of a rally, which Tehran desperately hopes is going to continue. Now, further collapse could really provide that spark for economic unrest. And then there's the regional picture.
First of all, I just want to reiterate 1 million real to $1. Holy moly. That's not a very good exchange rate at all. So anyways, back to what we need to talk about. You were talking about their axis of resistance, right?
Yeah, since the October 7th attack on Israel, the axis of resistance has been in tatters. The fall of Assad's government in Syria in December, that was a massive blow that stripped Iran of a key ally. And all this while the Trump administration continues to levy new sanctions. Just this week, they targeted any sale of sodium perchlorate to Iran. It's a chemical reportedly received from China and linked to that huge, unexplained explosion at the Shahid Rajai port in Iran.
And then there's Israel, always a major factor in this equation. They've consistently said they won't allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon and have threatened to strike Iran's facilities. So how is that playing into these already delicate negotiations?
I mean, it's a massive complication. I think it's part of the reason you're seeing the strain between the United States and Israel, or President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, Israel's threats are taken very seriously. Iran recently warned it would take special measures to defend its nuclear facilities if Israel continues its threats. They even had Iranian students forming a human chain at an underground enrichment site. It's an area built into a mountain specifically to defend against airstrikes. And Iran's also warned the U.S. it would view Washington, D.C., as complicit in any Israeli attack.
So with the U.S. demanding no enrichment and Iran insisting on it, are there any potential compromises being floated? Any creative off-ramps?
Yes, I mean, some ideas have been tossed around. One is a potential group from within the Mideast that would be backed by regional countries and the United States. They could maybe supply uranium to Iran. There are also other countries and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, who's offering low enriched uranium for peaceful purposes. But Iran's foreign ministry has been adamant that enrichment must come from within Iran's borders. Now, a similar fuel swap proposal did fail to gain traction. That was way back in 2010. So there is a history of skepticism here from Tehran.
So some progress, but the core disagreements remain, and the external pressures and threats are only intensifying. Sounds like we'll be circling back to this topic again soon. Time to get to our final topic of the week, and it involves an advisor to Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard and some pretty significant pressure on the U.S. intelligence community regarding Venezuela and the Tren de Aragua gang. Here we go. So, Kervin, let's start with the basics. Who is this advisor, and what specific intelligence report are we talking about, and what are these accusations based on?
So we're talking about Joe Ken. He's currently the chief of staff to the Director of National Intelligence, just like you said, Tulsi Gabbard. He was nominated by President Trump back in February to lead the National Counterterrorism Center, the NCTC. And this is a very significant role. Now, the controversy centers around a National Intelligence Council memorandum assessing the links between the Venezuelan government and the criminal gang Tren de Aragua, or TDA is what I'm going to call them. Emails, primarily obtained by the New York Times, but also CBS, and I've reviewed these with my own eyes. I had to see them myself before I could comment on them. They were dated around early April of this year, and it reportedly showed Kent asking for a rewriting of this intelligence memo.
A rewriting? I mean, that sounds significant. Like, what exactly was he asking to be changed? Was it a pretty substantial portion of it? And why? Why was he asking for this?
Well, the emails, I went right to the emails to get this out. It shows that he was concerned the initial draft was, in his words, weak IC speak. That was a quote from him in the email. This happens a lot. Weak IC speak, weak intelligence community speak. It's usually brought up when an analyst doesn't want to make an accusation one way or another. They're trying to take an easy way out of it. They'll use possible as a broad term in the entire report. They won't make a firm decision on something. Now, Mr. Ken apparently wanted the assessment to more closely align with the Trump administration's policies. Specifically, he pushed for it to include references critical of Biden-era immigration programs. He argued that the previous administration should also take some blame for this crisis. He then urged analysts to push to the top the analysis that Venezuela, as an adversary to the United States, knew about TDA's activities and did not stop them. He also tried to make what some might call, quote, common sense, end quote, connections between TDA and the Venezuelan government. For instance, he explicitly criticized the draft for leading with an assessment that they could not prove with smoking gun intelligence that the Venezuelan government was directing TDA, which he felt made it sound like the government had nothing to do with this gang. He also stated, quote here, another major issue I have with the analysis in this piece is its lack of context about the status of our border and immigration policy over the last 4 years.
And he suggested specific language regarding immigration.
Yeah, for example, he made one suggested edit. Quote, the IC also recognizes that between January 2021 and January 2025, the United States immigration policies and border security posture made migration from Venezuela to the United States so easy that the government of Venezuela did not need to push migrants to the United States. United States immigration policy served as its own pulling factor, end quote from him. He later approved another suggestion that, quote, increased flow of irregular migration could be attributed to a wide perception of lax U.S. immigration policies and a lack of screening at the border between 2021 and 2025, end quote.
And this is all happening in a specific policy context, isn't it? Like the Trump administration has taken a strong stance on groups like TDA.
Yeah, they're now terror organizations. And Trump himself had invoked the seldom used Alien Enemies Act of 1798 in March. He designated suspected gang members as wartime enemies. Now, shortly after, the administration used this act to remove 137 Venezuelans from the United States. So, an intelligence assessment that downplayed direct Venezuelan government control over TDA might complicate this policy justification. It is worth noting the final memo, dated April 7th and later declassified on May 5th, did assert the Maduro regime, quote, probably does not have a policy of cooperating with TDA and is not directing TDA movements to and operations in the United States, end quote. But it did include an FBI assessment that some Venezuelan government officials facilitate TDA members' migration.
Kervin, I want to go deeper into the nature of these alleged requests. From your experience, there's a world of difference between a leader asking for an intelligence report to be clearer or better formatted and asking for the analysis itself to be reframed to fit a certain narrative, to bolster a policy that that the current administration is trying to float right now. So how do you see the actions described in these emails in that context? Like, is this what some might call a slippery slope?
Yeah, Tiana, it absolutely is. And from an intelligence standpoint, this is where it becomes incredibly concerning. Look, I want to be clear. Having a leader demand changes to an intelligence report based on formatting, asking for clarifying remark, like, you need to clarify this, or even moving paragraphs around for better impact, that's extremely common. That happens day to day. Look, it's a lot like if you think about an editor asking a rewrite of an article to a journalist, that's part of the process to ensure clarity and utility. But what seems to be described here, based on the emails that I saw, this is different. It appears to me to be a direct effort not just to polish the report or this memo, but to direct an analyst to reframe their analysis based on political or ideological biases. The goal seems to have been to write the assessment in such a way that the previous administration also takes blame in this crisis. Also, to push to the top the analysis that Venezuela, as an adversary, knew what TDA was doing and didn't stop it. And frankly, to make common sense connections between TDA and the Venezuelan government, perhaps even when the hard intelligence might have been more nuanced or lacking that smoking gun I talked about. In the email itself, Mr. Kent even admits that this could be viewed as political. So I do think this was completely political. He went on to say that he didn't see it that way, but just to mention it, in the back of his mind, he knew this was a political move.
Okay, so you've drawn a very clear and critical line between routine editorial reviews of intelligence products and what appears to be, in this instance with the Joe Kent emails, pressure to reframe substantive analysis for potentially political ends, to assign blame, connect dots perhaps more assertively than the raw intel might warrant, or align with specific policy narratives. This distinction feels incredibly important. So, drilling down on that from your expertise as an analyst who has navigated these environments, could you unpack for our listeners the full spectrum of dangers here? Like, what are the inherent risks when this line is crossed? What does it mean, not just for the integrity of a single report, but for the analytical process itself, for the trust placed in the intelligence community, and ultimately for the quality of decision making that impacts our national security?
The danger is profound. To direct an analyst to reframe their analysis to fit a particular political agenda or to push for conclusions that align with policy preferences rather than raw intelligence, that is dangerous. No one could certainly argue it degrades national security because it means policymakers might not be getting the unvarnished truth they need to make critical decisions. What can't be argued is that it fundamentally goes against the core principles of intelligence reporting, which must be objective and free from such policy-driven bias. Now, when intelligence is shaped to fit a narrative, it loses its integrity and it loses its value. Just like you said, it erodes trust, not just between analysts and their leadership, but also between the intelligence community and the policymakers that they serve, and ultimately, the public. Now, I can tell you in the past, I have seen situations where analysts, myself included, have had to stand firm on our analysis. I even had times where I had to make it difficult for my reports to be altered once I send it in to leadership, because I didn't want my integrity compromised. That looks bad on me. But then it also is poor intelligence, and it could lead to someone's death. Now, this kind of pressure puts analysts in an incredibly difficult position.
Well, thank you for clarifying and for that very stark warning. So, with that in mind, what has been the fallout from these email revelations? Like, how have the ODNI and Kent himself responded, and what's the view from Capitol Hill?
Well, the ODNI, after being contacted by CBS News, offered to share a selection of Kent's declassified, partially redacted emails. These are ones that I saw because they did put that in, and CBS News did put out these just in PDF form. These emails, I read them. Now, Kent himself posted a statement on Twitter defending his actions. He said that, quote, "I'm honored to do my part," end quote. Interestingly, since this came to light, Director of National Intelligence Gabbard did fire the acting chair of the National Intelligence Council. That's Michael Cowlins. Also his deputy, Maria Langen-Rickoff. Now, both were recipients of Kent's emails. So when you look at the email, it's the back and forth there. Email from Joe Kent to these individuals, then those individuals replying back to him. So most likely, because they were fired because that's where the New York Times got this story from. Now, Kent's own deputy stated on X that these, quote, Biden holdovers were being dismissed because they politicized intelligence, end quote.
pot, meat, kettle. What is he talking about?
Right.
That's what he was trying to do, politicizing intelligence. Okay, whatever. He's just mad that they had a conscience and leaked the emails, and he thought it was going to stay on the hush hush. But oh well, that's what happens sometimes. Okay, so, I mean, it's such a very direct counter accusation, essentially turning the charge of politicization back into these dismissed officials from the National Intelligence Council. And it certainly adds another layer of complexity to this situation. Amidst these internal OD&I, my mouth is like cotton right now. I keep drinking water and it's not doing anything. Anyways, amidst these internal OD&I dynamics and such strong statements, what has been the reaction from Congress to these developments, including the firings? I know they probably don't care, but
yeah, well, I mean, and that's all politicized as well, right? Because it's the Democratic leadership of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees that have raised these serious alarms. Senator Mark Warner, he called it a blatant attempt to politicize national security. He said the Senate should, quote, immediately halt consideration, end quote, of Kent's NCTC nomination. Now, Representative Jim Hines stated that, quote, seeking to strong-arm analysts to suit the agenda of the president is a road to national security disaster, end quote. So he believes what we're saying. This is a national security issue. But it's not a universally held view. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he believes the IC was wrong in its assessment of TDA and agreed 100% with the FBI's findings, which, as we noted, had a slightly different emphasis.
I'm surprised Marco Rubio had time to give his take on this with his 5 friggin' jobs that he's holding right now.
Yeah, I just saw, and well, it wasn't a conference, it was a Senate hearing with him, and he was having a back and forth with the Democratic leader, and they were doing just that, just what you said, Sienna. He was like asking Secretary of State Rubio, I guess that I'll call him that because that's his highest position.
Right.
Like, how do you find time in the day to do all of your work? And Marco Rubio basically told him, well, it's not easy, and it makes it even more difficult when I'm having to sit here and answer your questions when I could be off doing good things in other agencies that I lead.
All 12 agencies.
Yeah. So he kind of threw it back on him. Why am I here?
Anyways, I know this entire thing is a critical issue for you. That's what the foundation of your career has been,
yes,
is intelligence. Bias and politicizing intelligence analysis is something you are vehemently against. Thank you for breaking this down for us with such clarity and drawing on your own perspective and experience within the IC. Is there anything else you would like to discuss?
No, I think that's it for my side for now. Do you have anything you want to talk about?
No.
Good. Okay.
Thank you so much for listening to This Week Explained. We hope you found it both informative and engaging. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.